Good morning, everybody, and happy May Day. It probably isn't May Day when I release this video, but it is May Day when I'm filming it. So this month of May, I decided to participate in my very first month-long readathon challenge, and that is the Asian Readathon, which was started by with Cindy, who, if you don't know who she is, first of all, look her up because she's one of the bigger booktubers right now, but also she's really chaotic and weird and fun, and she's one of my favorite booktubers to watch. She's one of the booktubers that kind of got me into this whole thing. She started the Asian Readathon a couple of years back and has been doing it every year since. And this year I decided to participate partly because I wanted to try a readathon, and also partly because I realized when I was doing my Do I Have That Other Book tag way back in January that for the Do You Have a Book by an Asian Author, I really only had one or two. I've obviously read other books by Asian authors, but not really a ton, and I realized that I had only been reading books very recently, I guess, by Asian authors. I'd only started to do that in the last couple of years, and so I decided to expand my reading a little bit. Because as Cindy will tell you, there are tons of countries that could qualify as Asian countries, obviously, and a lot of times people think that they can just read a bunch of books by Chinese authors and then they're done, or a bunch of books by Korean authors and then they're done. And so she created this challenge as a way to help people expand their reading knowledge of the Asian world. The Readathon has 5 different challenges, and for the challenges you can overlap books, so you can read a book that qualifies for more than one challenge and it still counts. You don't have to read 5 books, but every individual book that you read for each challenge has to be by an author from a different ethnicity. So you can't read 2 books by Indian authors and then have them both count. These are the challenges that she's doing. Challenge 1, read a book by an Asian author. Easy, right? Challenge 2, read a book with an Asian protagonist. And a lot of the time, those are gonna overlap. If it's a book by an Asian author, it oftentimes will have an Asian protagonist. Not 100% of the time, I can think of one notable example that doesn't really, but most of the time it will. Number 3, read a book by an Asian author in your favorite genre. In my case, that's fantasy, so I'm going to look at some Asian authored fantasies to read, but in your case, it might be romance, or it might be a thriller, or, some other genre that I can't think of right now because it's too early in the morning. Challenge 4, read a nonfiction book by an Asian author. And challenge 5, read a book by an Asian author that is not US-centric. Also, as another part of the challenge, Cindy is hosting a giveaway. If you donate at least $1 to a charity that helps Asians around the world or Asian Americans, then you'll be entered into a drawing for an Asian book of your choice. And I will put a link in the description to that. Even if you don't really want more books or need more books, I would highly recommend that you do donate to a cause that helps Asians, because as much as we all love reading really isn't activism, and we shouldn't see it as such. I know, I've seen the studies on the benefits of reading and how it can help you be more empathetic as a person, and believe me, I'm the hugest advocate for reading that there is, but I know that you can't just read a bunch of books and call it a day. You have to get out there, put yourself out there, or at least put your funds out there and help people. The doc I'm going to link in the description has a list of many different charities that you can choose from. The one that I chose is Welcome to Chinatown. This is a foundation that helps support businesses in New York's Chinatown and also the people that live there in order to make sure that those businesses and those people are thriving and well, especially during the pandemic. So I highly recommend that you check that out. In the meantime, I'm going to tell you the books that I'm going to read for this readathon, and then also a few books that you could potentially read for the readathon, even though I have already read them. The first book I'm planning to read for this readathon is actually a book that I've already started, and you've heard me talk about it before. It is 3 Daughters of Eve by Elif Shafak. This book won, I guess, my quick to judge book tag when I went through all the unread books I had and read the first paragraph, and this one was the one I was most interested in. This story is mainly about a young Muslim woman named Perry, and it goes through 2 different timelines of her life living in Istanbul, her time as a child, adolescent, and young adult when she's growing up there, and then going to school at Oxford in England. And then also her timeline now when the year is 2016, she's a mother with a child, and she's still living in Istanbul but the connection to her time at Oxford in some cases has been severed or isn't as strong, and sort of the navigation of like how she got to that place from where she was as a young woman. Since this book takes place in Istanbul, which is technically a city that exists both in Asia and Europe, it was kind of a challenge for me to determine whether this would count as an Asian book or whether it could count more as like I suppose a European story. But at one point in the book, at least the part that I've read so far, I haven't read like all of it yet, but the Perry's family does live on the Asian side of Istanbul when she's a young child. So, and also the author that wrote this was written up in the Asian Review of Books. So I think it's fairly safe to determine that this is an Asian book. And I really would like to finish it because I started it and just haven't been able to finish it. There's been a lot of stuff going on for me. I am also very interested in the discussions about religion that I've read so far in this book. Perry is trying to figure out where she falls as far as following Islam. Her family observes Islam, although her dad is like not super into it anymore. And then she goes off to college and meets other Muslim young women like herself. So I really would like to finish that and see where those discussions end up. This book could count for Asian author, protagonist, and non-US centric because it takes place in Istanbul and in the UK. For the nonfiction portion of this challenge, the book I would really like to read is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. Chanel Miller was the woman who, for a while, was known only as Emily Doe. She was the woman who was assaulted by Brock Turner a few years back, and she released a statement under the name Emily Doe talking about her experience with that in order to assist with the conviction of Brock Turner in his trial. And a couple of years ago, she released a memoir under her own name, and I've heard fantastic things about it. Just about everybody I have heard of that has read it has really loved it. And I've seen some quotes from it, and they're really stunning. She's clearly a very good writer. So I would really like to read this to hear a bit more about her side of the story. She's of Chinese descent, so far I have a Turkish author and a Chinese author. For the book in my favorite genre, that is obviously fantasy for me, so I decided to do The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nhi Vo. I read a review of this book on fantasyliterature.com, which is one of my very favorite fantasy review websites, and they had a lot of really good things to say about it. This is sort of a journey fantasy. It seems like about two adventurers who are on their way to the court of the Empress. And it also discusses social upheaval and revolution, and it has some LGBT rep I've heard. I've also heard the writing is really good. So, and I thought that an adventure fantasy story that also tackles some serious issues but isn't too long, that sounded exactly like what I would like to read right now. Also, Nhi Vo is Vietnamese. Now at this point I think I have all of my challenges covered, but if I have some time, I'm going to talk about a couple more books that I would like to read. One of them is The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. This is a book that was recommended to me by a friend, and I'm very excited to read it. It's actually a book club pick for my book club in the next couple of months, so I'm a little bit early on that, but if I have some time, I'd like to read it for this readathon. I really haven't read many Indian authors like at all, honestly, probably zero. And this sounds like a really interesting family saga told over generations, and I know that this author is one that my friend has recommended, so I wanted to try it out. Another book I'm interested in reading if I have time is The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water by Zhen Cho. I had heard Zhen Cho's name before. She's a Chinese-Malaysian author, and she wrote Sorcerer to the Crown, which is a book I've heard quite a bit about. This particular book is another fantasy novella, and it's based on Chinese wuxia tradition. And for those who don't know about that tradition, which, I didn't know much about it either, I had to look it up. It's kind of it's like a martial arts fantasy. It's a fantasy usually about martial artists and how they fight for justice and against oppression in their communities and nationwide. And in that way, it's a little bit similar to knight-errant stories in English folklore. However, unlike those stories, the martial artists and wuxia stories usually do not serve a particular king or lord. They're just fighting to liberate people for its own sake. And usually they're from lower social classes. And they're often from, oh my gosh, why is that so hard to say? They're often from lower social classes, unlike knights who are usually noble. I'm always down for a buddy adventure fantasy sort of thing, and this sounded like it would fit the bill. Also, and this is really pushing it, I really don't think I'm going to have time to read any more books, but if possible, I also own a copy of The Interpreter of Maladies by Jubal Lahiri. This is a book that I picked up a few months ago in a used bookstore, and it's a Pulitzer Prize winner, so that's pretty cool. And if I have some time, I'd like to read it. I know Jubal Lahiri is Indian, and so is Arundhati Roy, so it probably wouldn't count for another challenge. But I haven't read a collection of short stories in a long time, and Jubal Lahiri is supposed to be a very good writer of short stories. Now, let's say you don't want to read any of the books that I listed for whatever reason. I have still read quite a few that I could recommend to you. Celeste Ng is awesome. She's written 2 books, Everything I Never Told You and Little Fires Everywhere. Little Fires Everywhere actually doesn't have an Asian protagonist. It has protagonists that are mostly white and then one character whose race is unspecified, but in the later TV series on Hulu, I think, that character was black, and the author actually said that she conceived that character as black. But she didn't feel comfortable writing from the perspective of a black woman, so she just decided to leave the race open. So those books are really great. They're like kind of literary fiction. Everything I Never Told You, I guess, could be kind of a thriller too. If you like contemporary YA, David Yoon writes really fun books. He is Korean. He writes from the perspective of Korean American teenagers. I read Frankly in Love last year and I really liked it, and I recently finished Super Fake Love Song, which is his newer book, and I'm going to talk to you about that one in a couple of weeks. For a non-US centric book, Eileen Chang is a Chinese short story writer. I read a book of her short stories called Love in a Fallen City, and I really enjoyed those. They were translated, by the way, by Karen S. Kingsbury. And I think those take place at least partly in Hong Kong. It's been a while since I read them. I really enjoyed those. And of course, you've heard me talk about this book a ton of times, but I own it. And I think it would work for a lot of these challenges. These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. This is a fantasy retelling of Romeo and Juliet set in 1920s Shanghai, which is a super fun premise, and the book does, I think, deliver on that premise. I did have a couple of issues with it, but I would still recommend it if that's the kind of thing that you enjoy. And of course, in the doc that I am attaching, as I've mentioned 500 bazillion times, there are also a lot of other Asian books that you can check out. There's a whole big list. So that is my Asian Readathon TBR for this month. Let me know if you are also doing the Asian Readathon and what books that you are interested in reading for it. Have a great day, week, month, whenever you watch this. Just be great, okay? Just be great. Bye.